With the recent popularity of the Wicked movie, I thought we would take a look at the hidden history behind L. Frank Baum's novel, The Origin Story for Wicked, as we look at 19th century politics and how that plays into From the Wizard of Oz to Wicked. Who was Lyman Frank Baum, 1856 to 1919? Born just before the Civil War, died just after World War I. His life spanned an industrial revolution in the United States, massive changes as America becomes a global imperialist power. So, who was he? Baum was born to a fairly prosperous family in New York, Chenango. And as a child of a fairly privileged background, he was afforded the chance to be a fairly dreamy kid. He's described as sort of always being off in a daydream. In fact, he was in military school for a while, and he had to leave because they deemed him too much of a daydreamer. He was early on a writer, and in fact, his first book, written fairly young, was on breeding chickens. He got bit by the acting bug and took part in theater productions and left New York in 1888, so a good bit of time after the Civil War, with his wife, Maud. They ended up in South Dakota, where he and Maud operated a store. Um, the failure of this store did not deter Baum from continuing to write. And in fact, he relied on it as he became a newspaper publisher. And his newspaper writing kept him afloat through the not so prosperous early 1890s when there was a massive economic depression. So there is Baum, bespectacled and looking dreamy and curious all at the same time. The 1900 publication of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was a game changer for Baum. It was is as a writer of children's books that he found himself to be much more of a success than he had been in his other adventures. And Oz was so successful that it led him to write a series of follow-up works. And beyond that, the story of Oz, found life in numerous other forms. Um, 13 sequels followed it. There was a 1902 Broadway musical, which we do have the music for. It still is in existence. And then obviously the 1939 movie that made it so endearing and popular with Americans during the Great Depression. So all of his life, his dreams hadn't led to too much success, but Oz certainly opened that door for him. It was built largely from his life experiences living in South Dakota on the plains, as well as living in Chicago in the 1890s. And so we'll unpack how that experience in those two places affected him. If you look at the original 1900 publication, you'll see it's bright and very fun and futuristic, thanks in part to the pictures drawn by W. Denslow. And you can, of course, see all of these pictures online. They're iconic and endearing. So Baum's story found success. There were children's toys, movie, the Broadway play, and it entered into America's cultural consciousness as a distinctly American folk tale. And it sat there until the mid 20th century when a history teacher in New York asked people to reimagine Oz, not just as a story of a plucky little girl fighting her way back home, but as a parable, as an allegory on the populist movement. Henry Littlefield lived from 1933 to 2000 and was a beloved history teacher at Mount Vernon High School in New York. And he asked his readers to imagine that all of the people, all of the symbols in The Wizard of Oz were in fact representations of people and symbols in the early 1890s. Now, you might be wondering, what was the populist movement? This was a third party movement of farmers and workers that wanted to upend the political and economic order of the 1890s. They wanted America to think about a better distribution of wealth and resources, so that robber barons and the uber rich weren't getting everything. And so they came up with a third party that was pretty successful at the local level from 1890 to 1896. These third party folks were pushing for free coinage of silver so that there'd be an increase in the money supply. They wanted government ownership of railroads and telegraph. They wanted to improve conditions for working class people. And so what Littlefield was asking his readers to do is to think about the ways in which Baum lived through this populist movement. And The Wizard of Oz reflected his experiences in the 1890s. Littlefield's interpretation became so incredibly popular itself that it became required reading for generations of APUSH students. I myself was exposed to it in 1993, and in fact, my teacher required me to come stay after school and watch The Wizard of Oz. And up until the early 90s, essentially, people believed that The Wizard of Oz was, in fact, an allegory on the populist movement. Let's take a look at some of the symbols that Littlefield and other scholars have identified in The Wizard of Oz that they think represents a thinly disguised retelling of the story of populism. We'll start first with the main character, Dorothy. And Dorothy is just a simple Kansas farm girl living in a dreary, colorless world that many scholars have found reminiscent of the fiery populist speaker Mary E. Lease, a woman noted for telling farmers in the 1890s to raise less corn and more hell. And of course, Dorothy's spunkiness and her resilience, her willingness to stand up for what she believes in and for her friends, reminds many people of Mary Lease. The Tin Man, for a lot of scholars, represents the industrial worker, a person who is hollow on the inside and whose exterior has been replaced by metal, like the giant factories that dot the country. He is, of course, rusted and has lost his heart as industrialization has taken the United States to a new economic level of prosperity and power. It's done so by leaving workers empty and soulless. The Wicked Witch of the West, reflecting the fact that she is geographically from the West, would remind readers that the West is a harsh and unforgiving environment. It's very dry. And indeed, she is defeated largely because of water, the thing that would bring life and prosperity to Western farmers as well. Dorothy's companion is Toto, and scholars think that Toto is a shortening of the word teetotaler, which is a person who does not drink alcohol And many of the prohibition, teetotaler, temperance groups actually were in support of the Populist Party during the 1890s. The Cowardly Lion is apparently modeled after William Jennings Bryan, who, though he was a Democrat, spoke for populist ideas. The Emerald City, just like you might imagine in this allegory, would represent Washington, D.C., a city built on the color of money, green. Indeed, paper money in this time period was called greenbacks. And so this is a place where green symbolizes everything you could ever want. Though, in fact, if you read the book, you'll find out that the Emerald City isn't actually green. The wizard in the book forces everybody to wear glasses that make things look green. The scarecrow, found on most farms to ward off pests like crows, um, is a reminder of farm life as well, just like Dorothy. But the Scarecrow's role is to play the simpleton, who actually isn't as dumb as he thinks he is. And perhaps the message here is that farmers aren't as dumb as they think they are. Glinda, the Good Witch. Glinda's from the north, and scholars think that she very likely represents the 1896 vice presidential candidate from Maine, a man named Arthur Sewall, who was in favor of free silver with as the Democratic vice presidential candidate alongside of William Jennings Bryan. Um, Then we have the wizard himself, which most scholars think is a very thinly disguised portrait of the president, namely in that the president speaks a lot, makes a great big noise, but is kind of a fraud and really ultimately powerless when you get right down to it. He's a con man. The silver shoes. Okay, so this is an interesting detail that differs when you look at the book versus the movie. In the book, the shoes that Dorothy gets from the Wicked Witch of the East, uh, when her house falls on the Wicked Witch, those shoes are silver. And scholars think that that is a nod to the free silver movement of the Populist Party during the 1890s. In the movie, of course, the shoes were made into ruby because the people who made the movie thought that silver would not show effectively on screen as ruby would. The poppy field. When the trio end up in the poppy field and they are falling asleep, a lot of scholars think that this is a nod to China since poppies come from Asia and are used to make opium. And certainly a lot of Americans at this time period have access to opium. It's widely used as a medication. People sometimes mix it with alcohol. So it's something that Americans would have known and been aware of in the time period. The yellow Winkies. This is not something that shows in the movie as much as it does appear in the books. The Winkies are a yellow loving people of Winky country. Everything's yellow, they love yellow. And a lot of scholars think this is a nod to the Filipinos. The United States had recently been in a war with Spain in 1898 and had taken the Philippines. And there was a huge debate about the future of Filipinos in America and what would their status be. So a lot of conversation about this group of people from the Philippines. The winged monkeys are often described by scholars as a nod to the Plains Indians. Um, and of course, this is a very racist depiction because the idea here is that they swoop in out of nowhere. They do the bidding of the Wicked Witch. So they're dangerous and scary and frightening, but they're also monkeys, so it implies that they're uncivilized. The yellow brick road is a nod to the gold standard, which is what the US economy based its currency on. Populists in the 1890s wanted to issue more free silver, so coin more silver coins and increase the money supply. Gold was largely seen as the opposite of what they wanted. A gold backed money supply would be a smaller money supply. There'd be less money in circulation, though the value of money would be higher. And then finally, there's Oz itself, which many scholars have thought that that's perhaps a nod to the abbreviation for ounce, which is what you measure gold and silver in. If you take all of these images together, it does seem like it's a nod to the Populist Party, a group of farmers who created a third political party in the 1890s, who were pushing for free silver and for the US government to pay more attention to the needs and concerns of farmers. You can see references to foreign policy with China and the Filipinos. So these things seem to make sense as images. Um, and it's why scholars felt like as soon as Littlefield published this, everything clicked for them. It made sense. This has got to be, obviously, um, a correct interpretation of what L. Frank Baum was trying to do. At the end of the book and towards the end of the movie and towards the end of the book, Dorothy and her friends get gifts. And the gifts differ depending on if you're reading the book versus the movie. And it's worth kind of reflecting on the importance of those gifts. After all, they went a long way and they braved killing a wicked witch in order for Dorothy to get home and for the Scarecrow to get brains, and for the Tin Man to get a heart. So the gifts in the book are slightly different. Um, in the movie, the Scarecrow gets a diploma, right? That's how you indicate that you have brains. But in the book, he's given a container of bran, pins, and needles that will give him brand new brains and will make him sharp. So it's a little bit of a play on words here. The Tin Man does get a heart. In the book, it's described as a silk heart stuffed with sawdust. So it's not a real heart. Obviously, the same in the movie, not real. The Cowardly Lion in the movie is given a medal, but in the book, he's given a potion. And the potion, of course, will make him brave and courageous. Perhaps that's alcohol, but then again, who knows? Drink for courage could be anything. And Dorothy, of course, in both the book and the movie, has the silver shoes, which she does not learn until later that the silver shoes would take her home all along, which kind of invites us to sort of ask, was the was it worth it? Was the journey worth it? And some scholars have wondered if Baum was asking the populists the same question after trying to become a political party that would change America for the better for farmers and working people. Did the populists actually achieve what they wanted? The answer is no. They lost the election of 1896. They also lost again in 1900. And so, was their journey worth it? Did the populists end up changing America in any significant way? Or was the sort of journey about the friends you make along the way? It's interesting to consider that question because the populists' ideas eventually do become major political changes in the United States, starting in 1902, when progressive politicians adopt a lot of the populist movement's ideas and implement them into law. We will get new amendments to the Constitution. We'll get a lot of changes at the local and state level. So maybe the journey was worth it after all. So it brings us back to the question of, was this an allegory? You know, was this a thinly disguised retelling of the history of this third party, the populists, who weren't successful ultimately, but who were popular for a moment? And it's really hard to answer this question because we don't have any information from Baum where he explicitly describes what he was thinking and why he was doing what he was doing. So it's not conscious that he is writing this allegory. It could possibly be below the level of his conscious thought. After all, these symbols that we've identified are all around him. As a newspaper man, as a thinking, breathing American in the 1890s, he would have encountered countless stories and conversation and discussion about Plains Indians, whom he actually did write an editorial at one point suggesting they all be eliminated. Scholars still debate whether that editorial was meant to be sarcastic or actual, factual, realistic. He would have seen constant discussion about silver, free silver, the gold standard. China would have come up because of the Boxer Rebellion in 1900 and the US sending troops in order to protect American interests in China. The Philippines being annexed to the United States. Every one of these things were part and parcel of his daily experience. Even William Jennings Bryan as the lion has an analog, has a direct representation in a cartoon of the time period, which depicts Bryan as a lion with a free silver medal hanging around his neck. And countless visual representations of things like gold and silver would have shown in plenty of the cartoons of the age, the visual representations of the age. So Baum may have not intended this to be an allegory, at least directly intentionally, but he did borrow from the symbols, from the images, from the experiences that were all around him. Now, that has not stopped scholars from offering other readings of Baum's work. There's a Christian reaction to Baum, where some people have seen Dorothy's journey as kind of like a pilgrim's progress. And other people have actually criticized it from the Christian point of view to say witches and wizards, that's not Christian. So there have been plenty of other interpretations of The Wizard of Oz over time. There is, in fact, a feminist one. It is known that Baum endorsed women's suffrage, which was gaining in popularity and power as a political discussion point in the 1890s. It would not take place until 1920. But his mother in law was, in fact, a radical suffragette. So Baum encountered countless arguments for women's suffrage and women's empowerment. So some scholars have said that Dorothy is essentially a feminist icon. After all, she is the heroine, the hero, the shero, whatever you want there, of the story. And she displays boundless courage. She is constantly rescuing her friends and helping to lead them along the way. So this is not a story in which a man has the heroic part. And in fact, if you go on and read other Oz stories, the rightful ruler of Oz was supposed to be a princess, Princess Ozma, who was taken by a witch and, in fact, transformed into a boy and was not aware of her identity as Princess Ozma. Instead, she spends part of her time as this boy named Tip. Historian William Leach, whose Investigations into consumer culture in this time period were actually part of my graduate school readings, has written extensively about Baum and consumer culture. Um, in many ways, Baum was helping readers respond to a new culture of technology and material progress. And you see that constantly referenced throughout the books. Positive thinking is important in this world. Abundance is everywhere, and America has everything that it needs. Um, we can trace this too to the fact that Baum himself, being the owner of a store, was very interested in buying and selling and the consumer presentation of goods. Um, Baum even founded a journal explaining and offering tips and suggestions on how to decorate stores and store windows to encourage people to consume goods. So there is both a feminist and a materialist reading that is possible for The Wizard of Oz as well. Now, how does this translate into the modern movie that we've all enjoyed? I myself 3 times now, 3.5 really. And that is Wicked, which I've also seen in the Broadway play form and loved ever since it came out. So what's the connection here? Well, Gregory Maguire, the author of Wicked, wanted to explore the prequel to the Dorothy story and explain how this world came to be. And in doing so, he offers us some other musings about humans and human nature. And some of those musings translate into the Broadway musical, some of them don't. The book Wicked, in many ways, is vastly different than the Broadway musical Wicked. Glinda once famously asks in the opening of the musical, are people born evil or do they have wickedness thrust upon them? So it's, of course, inviting the reader to think about how we label people, good or evil. Are people born that way? In psychology, we would phrase this as the nature nurture problem. Are people born by nature wicked, or are they nurtured into wickedness? And this is a very age old problem in philosophy and human history. What determines our goodness or our wickedness? The wizard himself offers some interesting musings on goodness and wickedness as well. And he does so in a song where he's singing to Elphaba that essentially people believe in all kinds of things that are not true about other people. And we call that history. As he sings, a rich man's a traitor or liberator, a rich man's a thief or a philanthropist. Is one a crusader or ruthless invader? It's all in which label is able to persist. And that invites us to ask, when we measure someone's wickedness or goodness, are we actually thinking about them? Are we thinking about the labels that have come to be applied to them? How do we define someone as wicked? You know, the Gilded Age was full of robber barons, as we're learning in this unit. Men who were ruthless and crushed their competition, but who also gave to charity in order to build up their public image and make themselves look better. So, should we judge the robber barons as cruel, wicked people? Or should we look at their philanthropy and excuse what they did? The movie also makes very much stronger the theme of othering, because the wizard and Madame Morrible are using the Great Drought in order to demonize animals. They know that in order to unite Oz, one of the ways to do that is to create an enemy. And that enemy can become the animals that you can blame for all the problems of Oz. So animals are speaking out in the movie, but of course they keep disappearing as well. I'll leave you with a musing set of musings on the themes of Wicked that I have to give credit to Matt Bernstein for in his Instagram post on this. These are quite good and very thoughtful, and probably the best summation of how we should think about the themes of the musical. Matt starts by observing that the musical is essentially a musing on fascism and then how we respond to that fascism through two people's choices about how they respond to what they encounter. Um, Bernstein notes that Wickedness is a story about how a wizard has taken over a society and he has conned them. He is a con man, he is dishonest. And he's done so by stripping minorities, the animals, of their rights. And he's used hatred against them in order to shore up his own rule and distract people from the fact that he has no real power. He has essentially made Oz great again. And then, of course, enter into this story Glinda and Elphaba. Glinda is a privileged white woman who comes from a wealthy background, and Elphaba is a woman who spent her life being on the outside, cast aside for the color of her skin, disowned essentially by her father, who treats her so horribly. And yet, she moves through the story, at least the first half of it, trying to be loving and kind and supportive, but she is ultimately broken out of this by her realization that everything around her has been a lie. And she makes a choice, a very deep moral choice, that she cannot support a corrupt system, a broken government that has lied to her and manipulated her. So Elphaba will not give in to what the wizard wants. She has real power, he does not. And she decides that she's not going to support his fascist program, and therefore she becomes the Wicked Witch of the West. Wickedness is thrust upon her. The moral choice for Glinda is to not resist. And in doing so, she wants to remain friends with Elphaba. She loves Elphaba, but she can't bring herself to join Elphaba's cause. And in fact, she becomes a puppet of the wizard's regime. She is used to prop up the system of corruption. The thing that Bernstein points out is that Wicked then parodies how we end up judging these people. Because Glinda appears to be good, she's the good witch. Elphaba gets labeled as evil, and propaganda that is produced about Elphaba emphasizes her wickedness. As Madame Morrible says over the loudspeakers, this green skin of hers is a manifestorium of her inward twisted nature. And it asks us to think, when we're judging other people, are we judging accurately and fairly? Or have we looked at someone and unfairly concluded that they are in fact wicked? Bernstein points out this has an obvious parallel to um, Hitler's Germany, in which Jews were demonized, physically demonized for their appearance in order to suggest that they are inwardly evil as well. So, is the Wicked Witch good or is she bad? How do we define that? Um, the fact of the matter is, Bernstein wants us to understand, people are capable of both. It's as Sirius Black says in the Harry Potter franchise, people have both light and dark in them. It is what we do with our abilities and our talents and our understandings of the world. So, Elphaba is not inherently evil. There's not something inherently wrong about her. She just takes a principled position about the wizard that gets her labeled as evil. And then, of course, just like the animals, she becomes the victim of a campaign. And that is always what fascist societies do. They identify scapegoats. I mean, it's no coincidence that Dr. Dillerman is a literal goat. Scapegoats allow those in power to blame someone else for problems. It's the immigrants' fault. Um, it's the animals' fault. It's the Jews' fault. Whichever regime you're talking about, it allows that regime to excuse its own failings and say, don't look at me, look over there. That's your real enemy. And of course, in the process, even someone who gets labeled as good gets punished too. Glinda has to sacrifice what makes her human, what makes her a good person on the inside when she stops being shallow. And in that sacrifice, she loses her own humanity. So, whether you're looking at the original Wizard of Oz as a commentary on populism or consumer culture or feminism, or the modern day adaptation of Wicked, the stories offer us some musings on our own lives. They ask us to reflect on who we are and the culture in which we are situated.